Most of us walk around assuming the moral compass we use, valuing compassion, equality, and humility, is an absolute truth. We tend to think these values were either handed down by a divine authority or discovered through centuries of rational enlightenment. In 1887, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche proposed a much darker origin story. In his book On the Genealogy of Morality, he set out to investigate where these specific values actually came from. Nietzsche describes our morality as a psychological scar, a weapon forged in ancient power struggles and maintained through refined cruelty. To understand how we arrived here, we need to perform what Nietzsche called a genealogy. We are going to trace the bloody, material history of three core pillars of our moral lives: the concepts of good and evil, the feeling of guilt, and the practice of self-denial. Tracing these concepts back to their roots forces a very uncomfortable realization. Realizing our morals have a dark, manufactured history forces us to question our own identities and what we consider good. Long before our current values existed, aristocratic ruling classes operated on a system of master morality. In this framework, good stood for power, health, and vitality. The word bad was its simple opposite, a descriptor for the weak, the common, and the unfortunate. The oppressed masses trapped at the bottom of this hierarchy were completely unable to physically fight back against their rulers. Over time, this absolute powerlessness bred a toxic, seething hatred. Nietzsche called this psychological state resentment. Unable to win on the battlefield, the oppressed enacted an imaginary revenge by inverting these definitions. The master's strength was rebranded as evil. The slave's inherent passivity and inability to strike back were relabeled as goodness. This semantic inversion allowed the powerless to psychologically conquer the strong without lifting a single sword. By convincing the rulers that their natural power was a moral failing, the weak successfully waged a covert war that still shapes our culture. Curious tone. This brings us to the feeling of personal guilt. If you look at the earliest uses of the German word for guilt, Schuld, it pointed to a non-moral, material debt. Early law books quantified the exact amount of pain a creditor could inflict to balance a debt. If a debtor could not pay, the creditor was legally allowed to extract compensation in the form of torture. This was a physical transaction where the sheer pleasure of cruelty served as a valid currency. Eventually, humans were forced into enclosed, peaceful societies, but our natural predatory instincts for cruelty didn't just disappear. Because they could no longer be expressed outward onto others, humans began turning that violence inward, upon themselves. This internal violence birthed the human soul, our deep capacity for guilt and psychological suffering. These are the internalized scars left by the violent process of becoming civilized. The internalization of cruelty left early humans in a state of agonizing suffering, disconnected from their instincts and lacking any reason for their pain. To manage this crisis, a figure emerged, the ascetic priest. He offered the masses an ascetic ideal, a moral code that championed poverty, chastity, and the denial of worldly pleasure. The priest redirected this volatile energy by convincing the masses that their suffering was their own fault. He told them they were suffering because they were sinners. This caught their outward resentment and bent it backward in a loop, getting the sick to blame themselves. This diagnosis gave human suffering a meaning, which saved the species from a suicidal, meaningless nihilism. However, it permanently locked humanity into a cycle of self-destruction. This life-denying ascetic ideal outlived the religious era by putting on new masks. In secular culture, it was adopted by famous artists like the composer Richard Wagner, who used the imagery of self-denial to give his work a sense of spiritual depth. Influential philosophers did the same. Arthur Schopenhauer used the ascetic ideal to justify retreating from the messy, subjective reality of physical life into a supposedly pure mental realm detached from the body. Nietzsche warns that our modern devotion to science and objective truth is often just another version of this priest-led ideal. By demanding an absolute truth that exists outside of our own human perspectives and instincts, we are still practicing a form of self-denial, replacing God with an idol of truth.
Nietzsche isn't demanding that we return to a world of violent masters. Instead, he is demanding a revaluation of values. His final provocation leaves us with a difficult task.
Can we move beyond a psychology based on grievance and self-destruction? The challenge is to construct a new moral framework that affirms life and human flourishing, rather than demanding we suffer for them.